The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, tinny sound that was immediately swallowed by the sudden, oppressive silence. Brenda didn't look up. Her focus was absolute. Her world narrowed to the needle of her vintage industrial machine and the unforgiving line of a silk lapel. The stitch had to be perfect. The client was paying for perfection, and Brenda's hands, large and steady, always delivered. The scent of steamed wool and hot metal was the incense of her sanctuary, a small, meticulously organized tailor shop she had built from nothing. Here, the chaos of the city faded, and only the logic of thread and fabric remained. She finished the line, the needle punching through the material with a satisfying, rhythmic thud. Only then did she lift her head. 3 men stood just inside the door, their forms blocking the afternoon light and casting long, predatory shadows across the polished floorboards. They were sculptures of quiet menace, dressed in suits so dark they seemed to absorb the very air around them. The 2 flanking men were broad and watchful, their hands clasped loosely in front of them in a posture that was anything but relaxed. But it was the man in the center who held the room captive. He was leaner, his frame elegant and sharp under a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her entire inventory of fabric. His stillness was what struck her first. It was an absolute, deliberate lack of motion, as if the world moved around him and he was its fixed, unyielding center. His face was a collection of stark, beautiful lines, a strong jaw, a straight nose, eyes that were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. One of the larger men stepped forward, his polished shoe making no sound on the wood. "The lady of the shop?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that felt like an intrusion. Brenda pushed her glasses up her nose and leaned back in her chair, the old wood creaking in protest.
She didn't stand.
She let her presence fill the space from where she sat, her body solid and immovable. "I'm the owner," she said, her voice even. "Brenda, can I help you?" "Our associate requires a new suit," the man said, gesturing with his chin toward the silent figure in the center. Immediately, Brenda's gaze slid from the lieutenant back to the boss. She took in the impeccable fit of his current suit, the way the fabric draped perfectly over his shoulders, the subtle, clean break of the trousers over his shoes. The man appreciated quality, but his subordinate's tone grated on her like cheap polyester. "I see," she said, her voice deliberately calm. She folded her hands over the half-finished jacket on her workbench. "My process begins with a consultation. We discuss fabric, style, occasion. Then I take measurements. After that, there are typically 3 fittings before the final garment is delivered. My current wait list for new commissions is 6 weeks." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. A flicker of disbelief, then annoyance, crossed his face. "You misunderstand. We are not looking to be put on a list. We need it now." "And you misunderstand," Brenda replied, her tone losing none of its placid firmness. "I am a tailor, not a magician. A bespoke suit takes time. It takes respect. I don't do now." For the first time, the man in the center moved. He lifted a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and his subordinate fell silent instantly. The authority in that simple motion was absolute. He took a step forward, his eyes scanning her workshop. He didn't look at the clutter, but at the order within it. The rolls of fine English wool and Italian cashmere stacked neatly on shelves, the antique shears hanging from a magnetic strip, the paper patterns catalogued with obsessive precision. His gaze landed on the jacket under her hands, his eyes narrowing slightly as he appreciated the hand-sewn buttonhole she'd just completed. He saw the craft. He understood the language of her work. He finally met her eyes, and the air thickened, charged with a sudden, intense pressure. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. 6 weeks, he stated. It wasn't a question. At minimum, Brenda confirmed, refusing to look away. Her heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of defiance. She had built this place with her own 2 hands, had defended its integrity against entitled clients and condescending suppliers for years. These men were no different, just packaged more dangerously. "Unacceptable," the lieutenant grumbled, taking a half step forward as if to press the issue. Brenda's patience, a long and sturdy thread, finally snapped. She rose to her feet, and the full force of her presence, of a woman who was large and unapologetically so, who knew her worth down to the last stitch, filled the room. "Then you are in the wrong place," she said, her voice low and clear and final. "There's a department store 2 blocks down. I'm sure they can accommodate your schedule." She pointed a steady finger toward the door. "Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do. Please leave." A dangerous silence descended. The 2 guards tensed, their bodies shifting into a state of readiness. The lieutenant's face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten, to unleash the power they so clearly wielded, but the man in the center was already turning away. He gave Brenda one last look, a look that was appraising, unreadable, and lingered a fraction of a second too long. It was a look that catalogued her, filed her away. Then, without a word, he walked out of her shop. His men, after a moment of stunned hesitation, followed like obedient dogs, leaving behind only the ghost of his expensive cologne, a subtle, clean scent of cedar and smoke, and a silence that felt heavier than before. Brenda stood alone in her sanctuary, the chime of the bell echoing in the sudden emptiness. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling just slightly. She had just kicked out a man who moved like he owned the city. And she had the distinct, chilling feeling that this was not the end of it. The next morning, the world was too quiet. Brenda was used to the early sounds of the city waking up, the rumble of the first bus, the clatter of a bakery truck making its delivery. But today, her street was hushed, wrapped in an unnatural calm. A sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck as she turned the corner onto her block. And then she saw it. Parked directly in front of her shop, occupying the space with an air of indisputable ownership, was a massive wooden crate. It was pristine, untouched, and so large it blocked half the sidewalk. People on their way to work gave it a wide berth, their faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. Brenda's step slowed. Her heart, which had been beating at a normal morning rhythm, began a slow, heavy thud. She approached the crate as one might approach a sleeping predator. There were no shipping labels, no company logos. Just smooth, clean wood. Taped to the front, stark against the pale pine, was a single, severe black envelope. Her name, Brenda, was written across it in elegant, sharp calligraphy. Her fingers felt stiff as she pulled the envelope free. The paper was thick, expensive. Inside, there was no letter, only a heavy card. On it, a single sentence was printed in the same perfect script. For a tailor who respects her craft, there was no signature. There didn't need to be. The scent of cedar and smoke clung faintly to the card, a ghostly signature she recognized immediately. This was from him, Kwon Ji-han, the man she had thrown out of her shop. She looked from the card to the crate, her mind racing. This wasn't an apology. It wasn't a threat, not in the conventional sense. It was something else entirely. A gesture so audacious, so public, it was a declaration. He had seen her old machine, her reliable but aging singer. He had understood her world, and now he was invading it, not with force, but with a gift so extravagant it was a form of coercion. It was a claim. With a sense of dread and inevitability, she found a small crowbar in her shop and pried open the crate. The wood groaned in protest. Inside, nestled in a bed of protective foam, sat a brand-new Juki industrial sewing machine. It was the top of the line, a magnificent piece of German engineering that cost more than her car. Its black metal body gleamed, a silent, powerful beast waiting to be unleashed. It was the machine she dreamed of, the one she would have to save for another 5 years to afford. And it was sitting on her sidewalk. She couldn't refuse it. Leaving it on the street was impossible, and there was no return address. Having it hauled away would be a deliberate, public insult, and she had a chilling certainty that insulting a man like Kwon Ji-han a second time would have consequences far graver than an expensive gift. He had backed her into a corner, using her own professionalism as the cage. He knew she couldn't resist a tool this perfect. He was right. It took 2 hours and the help of 2 burly men from the neighboring hardware store, who asked no questions but accepted her cash with wide eyes to get the machine inside and installed. It dominated her workspace, its modern, surgical precision a stark contrast to the warm, worn-in comfort of her old equipment. She spent the rest of the morning in a daze, unable to work, her eyes constantly drawn to the silent, imposing gift. Late in the afternoon, the bell chimed again. This time, she was expecting it. Kwon Jihan stood in the doorway, alone. He was dressed more casually today, in dark trousers and a soft, charcoal cashmere sweater that did nothing to soften the lethal grace of his posture. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding the new machine. A flicker of something, satisfaction, perhaps, passed through his gaze before it settled on her. "I trust it is acceptable," he said, his voice a low, quiet timbre that filled the small shop. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture that felt flimsy and inadequate. "It's excessive." "Quality is never excessive," he countered, taking a slow step closer. He wasn't looking at her with menace. He was looking at her with an unnerving, focused intensity, as if she were a complex pattern he was determined to understand. "I came to schedule a consultation." The audacity of it almost made her laugh. He had forced his way back into her world with an impossibly expensive gift, and now he was here, politely asking for the very thing she had denied him. He was following her rules, but he was doing it on his terms. She knew she had no choice. Refusing him now would be pointless. She was already caught in his web. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "My book is open." He nodded, a small, sharp motion. Now is good. It wasn't a demand this time. It was a simple statement of fact, and somehow they both knew she would agree. She led him to the back of the shop, to the consultation area, the air crackling with a tension that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the unspoken power dynamic that had just been irrevocably established. He had not broken down her door. He had given her a golden key and dared her to use it, knowing she would. The consultation was surreal. Brenda moved through the familiar rituals on autopilot, her professionalism a shield against the unnerving presence of the man sitting opposite her. She pulled out bolts of fabric, her hands gliding over superfine merino, wool and silk blends, heavy cashmere. Kwon Jihan watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. He didn't just look at the fabric, he understood it. He spoke of drape, of weight, of the way different weaves would hold a line. He was not a man who simply wore expensive clothes. He was a man who understood their construction, their power. "This one," he said, his long, elegant fingers brushing against a bolt of deep navy bird's-eye wool that she had been saving for a special commission. His touch was light, but it sent a strange jolt through the fabric, a current she felt even from a distance. "An excellent choice," she said, her voice more breathless than she would have liked. She pulled the heavy bolt from the shelf, her arms straining slightly. As she turned to place it on the cutting table, he stood and took one end, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but his skin was cool and smooth, and the shock of it was so unexpected it made her freeze for a second. The air crackled. She looked up and met his gaze. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the scent of cedar and wool, the weight of his stare. It was a moment of pure, undiluted tension, held and then broken as he helped her lay the fabric down. She cleared her throat and turned away, grabbing her measuring tape. "We can take measurements now." He removed the cashmere sweater, revealing a crisp white shirt that clung to the hard planes of his torso. The faint outline of a shoulder holster was visible beneath the fine cotton, a stark reminder of who and what he was. This was not just a client. This was danger, beautifully tailored and standing in the heart of her sanctuary. She worked with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. She tried to keep her touch impersonal, a series of professional points of contact. Chest, waist, inseam. But it was impossible to ignore the reality of him, the coiled strength in his shoulders, the warmth radiating from his skin. Her knuckles brushed the cold steel of his watch as she measured his wrist. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the soft scrape of the tape measure and her own quiet instructions. Arms straight, she murmured, moving behind him to measure his back. As her hands smoothed over his shoulder blades, she saw it. Tucked into the corner of the mirror they were facing was a small, faded photograph. It was her and her mentor, Samuel, taken years ago outside this very shop. Samuel, with his kind eyes and hands as skilled as her own, had been the one who taught her everything, the one who believed in her enough to co-sign the loan for this space. He had passed away 2 years ago. "Your father?" Jihan asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. His eyes were on the photograph in the mirror. Brenda's hands stilled. "My mentor," she said, her voice tight with memory. "He taught me the craft." Jihan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the image of the smiling older man with his arm around a much younger Brenda. "He taught you well," he said finally. It wasn't a compliment. It was a simple, quiet statement of fact. And in that moment, for the first time, the mask of the predator slipped and she saw a flicker of something else. Something human. It was a small, almost deniable moment of tenderness, but it was more unsettling than any threat. It suggested that the man beneath the steel was more complex, and therefore more dangerous, than she could possibly imagine. The fittings became a strange, recurring ritual of forced intimacy. Twice a week, Kwon Jihan would appear at her door, always alone, always punctual to the minute. He would step inside, and the atmosphere of her small shop would transform, charged with his silent, powerful presence. Brenda would lock the door, flipping the sign to closed, and they would retreat into the quiet world of chalk marks and pins, fabric and thread. She worked with a focused, defensive professionalism, her hands moving over the half-formed suit, adjusting a shoulder line, nipping in the waist. Her touch was clinical, yet she was intensely aware of the man beneath the fabric. She learned the landscape of his body, the hard muscle of his back, the slight tension he held in his shoulders, the way he stood with an unwavering, perfect stillness that spoke of immense self-control. She learned his name was Kwon Jihan from the fearful whispers of other shopkeepers on her street. They would watch his black sedan pull up, their eyes wide, and then hurry inside their own stores, heads down. They spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him the shadow of Gangnam, the head of the Kangpai faction that ran this territory with an iron fist. He was empire and debt, loyalty and violence. Brenda tried to ignore the stories, to separate the man who discussed the merits of a peak lapel with quiet intelligence from the brutal crime lord of street legend. But the evidence was always there, a cold weight in the room. It was in the surgical precision of his movements, the predatory grace that clung to him like his cologne. It was in the bulge of the holster under his arm that she carefully avoided as she pinned the jacket lining. During the second fitting, while she was on her knees adjusting the trouser hem, he spoke into the quiet. "I had a suit made like this once before," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "For my brother." Brenda kept her eyes on her work, her fingers pinching the fine wool. "A wedding?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Yes," he said. The single word hung in the air, heavy and cold. He was looking at his own reflection in the full-length mirror, but his gaze was distant, seeing something far beyond the confines of her shop. He never got to wear it. The silence that followed was profound. It was a void filled with unspoken tragedy. Brenda didn't need to ask what happened. The story was there in the sudden, bleak emptiness of his eyes, in the rigid set of his jaw. This was his wound. The one vulnerability he carried. A brother lost, a celebration that turned to ash. She had a sudden, vivid image of this man, this lethal predator, standing over a body, the promise of a shared future broken and bleeding on the ground. The loss wasn't just grief. It was a failure, a betrayal. She didn't know the details, but she understood the shape of the hole it had left in him. A cold, hard place where trust had once lived. She finished pinning the hem, her movements gentle. For a brief, insane moment, she had the urge to reach out, to offer a word of comfort. She crushed it instantly. Comfort was a currency she couldn't afford to trade with a man like this. The danger, when it came, was not from him, but for him. And she was caught in the crossfire. She was closing up late one Thursday, wiping down her cutting table, when a shadow fell across her doorway. It wasn't Jihan. Two men she didn't recognize stood there, their cheap suits and overly confident smirks a stark contrast to Jihan's quiet authority. "Brenda?" one of them asked, stepping inside without invitation. "Big woman like you, must be strong. But are you smart?" Brenda slowly placed her cleaning cloth on the table. She didn't answer. Her heart began a low, steady drum of alarm. "The boss of the Choi clan sends his regards," the second man said, his eyes roaming around her shop with a dismissive air. "He doesn't like it when people play with his rivals' things. And right now, Kwon Jihan seems to think you're his favorite new toy." The first man took a step closer, his smile turning ugly. "This is just a friendly warning. A man like Kwon Jihan has enemies. Getting close to him is a good way to get burned. Stay away from him. Stop making his suits. Forget you ever met him." Brenda stood her ground, her body a solid, defiant wall. "This is my shop," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her resolve. "My business. It has nothing to do with you or your boss." "That's where you're wrong," the man sneered, reaching out as if to touch a bolt of silk. "Everything in this territory has to do with us now. Or it will soon." Before his fingers could touch the fabric, the wail of tires screeching on pavement cut through the night. Headlights flooded the shop, blinding them for a second. A black sedan, identical to Jihan's, had mounted the curb, its engine rumbling like an angry beast. Two doors flew open and Jihan's men, the same silent, broad-shouldered guards from the first day, emerged. They moved with a swift, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. The two Choi men froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. Fear, stark and primal, flashed in their eyes. They didn't even try to fight. They turned and bolted out the back entrance of the shop. Jihan's men didn't give chase. They simply secured the front, their presence an impassable wall. Then, the back door of the sedan opened. Kwon Jihan unfolded himself from the car, his face a mask of glacial fury. He strode into the shop, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Brenda. He saw her pale face, the slight tremor in her hands. He had almost lost her. The thought was a shard of ice in his chest. He walked to her, stopping just a foot away, his shadow covering her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She shook her head, unable to speak. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She wasn't just a tailor anymore. She was a target, a piece on a board in a game she never asked to play. "You are not safe here anymore," he said, his voice absolute. "They will be back. You will come with me." It was not a request. It was a command, born from the cold terror of almost being too late. He was claiming her, not as a possession, but as a territory he would defend at any cost. "No," Brenda said, the word coming out as a harsh whisper. Her voice grew stronger as she found her footing, her defiance surging back like a tide. "No. I am not going to hide in your penthouse like one of your porcelain dolls. I am not your property, and I will not be your liability." Kwon Jihan's face, already a mask of cold fury, tightened further. The muscles in his jaw stood out in sharp relief. "This is not a negotiation, Brenda. The Choi clan marked you. They see you as a vulnerability. My vulnerability. They will not stop. So you'll lock me away?" She shot back, her fear transmuting into a hot, sharp anger. "You'll put me in a gilded cage to keep me safe? That's not protection. That's possession. I built this shop with my own two hands. I will not abandon it. I will not run." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until it was almost non-existent. He was so close she could feel the heat rolling off him, could see the dark, violent storm gathering in his eyes. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Let them get to you? Let them burn this place to the ground with you inside it." And that was when she said it. The words came from a place of primal survival, a place that understood the language of this world far better than her conscious mind did. It was a choice, a crossing of a line she could never uncross. "If you want to protect me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, raw and intense, "then don't hide me. destroy them. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their brutal simplicity. She was not asking for defense. She was asking for annihilation. She was telling the predator to hunt on her behalf. She had looked into the abyss of his world and, instead of recoiling, had told him to unleash it. A profound stillness fell over Kwon Ji-han. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the shock in the depths of his eyes. He had expected fear, tears, pleas for safety. He had not expected this. He had not expected a woman who would meet his violence not with rejection, but with a command. She was not a civilian caught in the crossfire. She was a queen demanding her army go to war. For the first time, someone was not asking him to be less of what he was, but to be more of it for them. The cold mask of the crime lord cracked. The fury in his eyes receded, replaced by something far more complex, something that looked almost like awe. He had seen her as strong, as a woman of integrity and rare skill. Now he saw something else. He saw a mirror to his own ruthless will, wrapped in a package he never could have anticipated. "You are not the liability," he said, his voice no longer a growl, but a low, resonant statement of fact. The sound vibrated through her, a physical force. "You are a complication I did not anticipate," he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray curl back from her temple. The touch was featherlight, yet it burned a trail on her skin. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. He said her name, just her name, Brenda. No one had ever said her name like that. It wasn't a label. It was a claiming. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, the sound of a final, irrevocable decision being made. In that moment, she knew she had done more than just ask for protection. She had bound herself to him, and him to her, with a challenge he could not possibly refuse. The war was no longer just his. It was theirs. The retaliation came sooner than she expected, but not in the way she had feared. Ji-han did not lock her away. Instead, two of his most trusted men were posted in a discreet, unmarked car across the street from her shop, a constant, silent vigil. But the Choi clan were not fools. They knew a direct assault on her would be met with overwhelming force. So they attacked the one thing she had left. They attacked her soul. She got the call at 3 a.m. It was from Ji-han himself. His voice was flat, controlled, but she could hear the ice underneath it. "They hit the shop," he said, without preamble. "Don't go there. I'm sending a car for you." She didn't argue. She threw on clothes, her mind a numb haze. When she arrived at his penthouse, a stark, minimalist fortress of glass and steel overlooking the glittering expanse of the city, he was waiting for her. He led her to a massive screen that dominated one wall. On it played a security feed. She saw her shop, the front window shattered. But there were no flames. No fire trucks. Ji-han pointed to the timestamp in the corner of the screen. "They threw firebombs an hour ago," he explained, his voice cold. "But my men had already been inside. We cleared everything of value after you left for the night. The building's fire suppression system contained the rest. They failed." Brenda stared at the screen, at the smoke-stained walls and broken glass of her sanctuary. He had saved the structure, but the violation was absolute. They had burned her. It was a message, scrawled in ash and soot. He thought he had protected her, but she felt a cold dread seep into her bones. They had still gotten to her. She kept watching the footage, rewinding it, her eyes scanning for any detail. Ji-han's security team was already analyzing it, but Brenda was looking with different eyes. She wasn't looking for strategy. She was looking for the familiar. And then she saw it. On one of the figures, a man who had lingered for a moment after throwing his device, the light from the flames caught the side of his neck. For a split second, a tattoo was visible. It was a coiled dragon, its tail ending in a distinctive, stylized lotus flower. Brenda's breath caught in her throat. "Stop," she said, her voice sharp. "Rewind. Zoom in there." Ji-han's analyst, a young man with sharp eyes, manipulated the controls. The image clarified. The dragon and the lotus. Brenda felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the fire. "I know that tattoo," she whispered. "That's Minjun." His sister runs the flower shop 2 doors down from me. He helps her with deliveries. Minjun was not one of the Choi clan's known enforcers. He was just a neighborhood guy, someone she'd nodded hello to 100 times. And he was part of Jihan's territory, under Jihan's protection. The implication was immediate and sickening. The attack wasn't just an external assault from the Choi clan. It was a betrayal from within. Someone inside Jihan's own organization had helped them. Someone had given them the timing, the layout. The rot was on the inside. She turned to Jihan, her eyes blazing with a cold, clear certainty. "It's a traitor," she said. "The choice had help. From one of your own." The room went silent. Jihan stared at the screen, his face unreadable, but a new, more dangerous coldness entered his eyes. His empire, the organization he ruled with absolute control, had been compromised. And she, the Tailor, the outsider, was the one who had seen it. Her intimate knowledge of her small world, the faces and names he would never notice, had just become his most valuable weapon. She had done more than just survive. She had become a strategic asset. She was no longer just the woman he was protecting. She was the one pointing him toward the heart of the real threat. The trap was set with surgical precision. Using the information Brenda had provided, Jihan's people put a quiet, immense pressure on Minjun. It didn't take long for him to break. He confessed everything, naming his contact within Jihan's inner circle, a lieutenant named Park, a man who had served Jihan's family for over a decade, driven by greed and a festering resentment. The Choi clan had promised him a piece of the territory once Jihan was gone. The firebombing of Brenda's shop was meant to be a distraction, a way to draw Jihan's focus while Park orchestrated a larger move. Jihan moved without hesitation. A meeting was called, a supposed strategy session to plan their retaliation against the choice. Park walked into the lion's den, completely unaware that he was the prey. Brenda insisted on being there. Not in the room where it would happen, but in the control center, a darkened chamber filled with monitors displaying every angle of the penthouse conference room. Jihan had hesitated for a moment, then agreed. He understood. This was her battle, too. She needed to see it through. She stood in the shadows of the control room, her arms crossed, watching the monitors. She saw Park enter, confident and smug. She saw Jihan, seated at the head of a table, his face a calm, placid mask that betrayed nothing. The meeting began, the talk of territories and tactics a low, meaningless drone. Then, Jihan lifted a hand. The room fell silent. "We have a traitor among us," Jihan said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Park's face twitched, a barely perceptible flicker of alarm. Jihan's eyes, cold and black, settled on him. A man who would sell his brothers for silver. A man who would help our enemies burn our territory. The blood drained from Park's face. He started to stand, to protest, but the 2 guards behind him were suddenly on him, forcing him back into his chair. It was over in a second. The betrayal, the denial, the capture, it was all a blur of quiet, brutal efficiency. Brenda watched, her heart pounding, as Park was dragged from the room. She did not flinch. She had asked for this. She had to witness the cost. Later, after the silence had returned to the penthouse, Jihan found her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. He came to stand beside her, the 2 of them reflected in the glass, a stark silhouette against the glittering darkness. "It's done," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on her reflection. The cold, hard mask of the leader was gone. In its place was something raw, something honest. "My organization was compromised," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of the admission. "My judgment was flawed. You saw what I could not. You made it whole." It was the highest form of praise he could offer. It was an acknowledgement of her, not just as a woman he desired or an asset he protected, but as an equal, a partner in the brutal calculus of his world. He held out a hand. In his palm was not a piece of jewelry or a token of affection. It was a set of keys and a rolled-up document tied with a black ribbon. She looked at him, confused. Your shop was a casualty of my war, he said. That is a debt I must repay. She unrolled the document. It was not a check. It was a deed, and under it, a set of architectural plans. Her eyes widened as she scanned the blueprints. It was a design for a new atelier, twice the size of her old shop, with a private living space above it. The address listed was in the heart of Gangnam, in a building she knew he owned, a fortress of commerce and power. Build it again, he said, his voice a low command that was also a plea. Stronger. Better, he paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, holding her captive. Here. With me. It was not a question. It was a statement of their new reality. It was the final move in a game that had started with a demand for a suit. A cost had been paid. Her old life, her old sanctuary, was gone forever. But in its place was a foundation. He was offering her a kingdom, not as a consort, but as a fellow monarch. Brenda looked from the plans in her hand to the man standing before her. She saw the lethal predator, the cold-hearted boss, the man who commanded an empire of shadows. But she also saw the man who had recognized her craft, who had shown a flicker of humanity for her mentor, who had admitted his own fallibility to her. She saw the complication he had never expected and the partner he had just found. Slowly, deliberately, she took the keys from his palm. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. The choice was made. The silence that settled between them was not empty. It was the sound of a foundation being laid, the first stone in a new empire they would build together.